deeply affected the entire county, particularly Stella, the residents of Stella, Missouri.
Investigators say Rowan Ford was abducted on November 3rd, 2007 by Christopher Collings. After a week of frantically searching in a sinkhole.
Stella, a quiet town of fewer than 200 people, where everyone knows everyone's name. But sometimes, trust can be the most dangerous thing of all. In 2007, 9-year-old Rowan Ford vanished from right inside her own home. A desperate search quickly spiraled into a haunting psychological chess match among those closest to her. Why did her guardian hide the truth during those critical first hours? And what dark reality lies behind two completely contradictory confessions for the exact same crime? Welcome to Crime Evidence. Today, we decode the shocking psychological mystery behind this tragedy. Deep in the heart of southwest Missouri lies Stella, a tiny, close-knit town with a population of fewer than 200 people. In isolated communities like this, doors are rarely locked, and neighbors are treated as extended family. This environment fosters a powerful yet fragile psychological phenomenon, the illusion of absolute safety. It is a dangerous complacency, the comforting belief that tragedy happens elsewhere, which often causes adults to lower their guard. In these quiet spaces, collective trust inadvertently creates a vacuum of vigilance. People assume that because everyone knows everyone, malice cannot find a foothold. But as historical behavioral analysis shows, the most devastating threats do not always knock loudly at the front door. They often manifest when protection is quietly withdrawn. At the center of this quiet world was 9-year-old Rowan Ford, a fourth grader who embodied pure innocence. Rowan was a gentle, hard-working girl who found solace in the simplest joys of childhood. Riding her blue bicycle, losing herself in books, and drawing in her room. Her life was deeply anchored to her local church, where she would eagerly arrive early on Sunday mornings, just to sit on the steps, waiting to help the pastor set up for the day's service. Teachers and neighbors remembered her as a vibrant ray of sunshine, a sweet child who always tried her absolute best. Yet beneath her bright smile lay a profound vulnerability. She was a young child who relied entirely on the protective instincts of the adults around her to shield her from the outside world. The fragile boundary of that protection shattered on the night of November 2nd, 2007. With her mother away working an overnight shift, the responsibility of safeguarding Rowan fell entirely on her 25-year-old stepfather, David Spears. Instead of maintaining a secure sanctuary, Spears chose to spend the evening drinking and socializing with his friends inside the home, while Rowan slept on her bedroom floor. As the night progressed, a critical behavioral failure occurred. The adults decided to leave the property to continue their activities at another location, leaving a 9-year-old child completely unattended in the dark. From a behavioral logic standpoint, this fateful choice reflects a severe deficiency in safety awareness and basic parental responsibility. It demonstrates how casual complacency can completely override protective logic, transforming a safe home into an exposed and defenseless target. This catastrophic lapse in vigilance paved the way for an event so heartbreaking it permanently reshaped the lives of everyone involved, leaving a permanent scar on the community and the seasoned professionals who investigated the aftermath. This was a horrendous crime. In my 44 years, I've worked a lot of homicides. This by far took the most effect on me. I have Rowan's school ID card here. I've carried it in my pocket ever since this incident happened, and I'll continue to carry it in my pocket after this. This enduring token of remembrance carried by the sheriff highlights how a single night of misplaced trust can ripple through decades, proving that the illusion of safety is often the most dangerous vulnerability of all.
Taking so long, why it had not been done. I hope it does give them a sense of closure.
Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings says the fourth grader's murder is a crime that still stays with him nearly 2 decades later.
This was a horrendous crime. In my 44 years, I've worked a lot of homicides. This by far took the most effect on me. I have Rowan's school ID card here. I've carried it in my pocket ever since this incident happened, and I'll continue to carry it in my pocket after this.
The morning of November 3rd, 2007, should have been entirely routine. When Colleen Spears returned home from her overnight shift, she expected to be greeted by the familiar sight of her daughter. Instead, she was met with a chilling, deafening silence. Rowan was nowhere to be found. When a frantic Colleen questioned her husband, David Spears, his response set off a devastating chain reaction. He claimed Rowan had gone to spend the night at a friend's house. Crucially, however, he could not name which friend. As Colleen's maternal instincts flared and she moved to call 911, David vehemently discouraged her, insisting that the child would be home soon. From a behavioral psychology perspective, David's immediate reaction requires deep analysis. Why does a guardian construct a lie when a child is missing? This behavior is a classic catastrophic manifestation of the primal fight-or-flight response, mutated here into profound psychological denial. When David woke up and realized Rowan was gone, he was instantly confronted with a terrifying reality: the undeniable consequence of his own gross negligence in leaving a 9-year-old entirely unattended the night before. Faced with this sudden, overwhelming crisis, his cognitive processing effectively collapsed. Instead of confronting reality and taking immediate action, his brain deployed a maladaptive defense mechanism focused solely on self-preservation. He was paralyzed by the fear of being held accountable, terrified of his wife's reaction, and the inevitable judgment of the community. By inventing a comforting narrative where Rowan was simply safe at a sleepover, David temporarily neutralized the immediate psychological threat to himself, effectively choosing his own comfort over the urgent reality of a missing child. However, this psychological self-defense came at an irreversible cost. In any missing person investigation, the initial time frame, universally known as the golden hours, is the most critical window for a safe recovery. During these hours, every ticking minute exponentially decreases the likelihood of finding the individual unharmed. By clinging to his fabricated story and actively discouraging Colleen from contacting the authorities, David systematically sabotaged this vital window. The tragic result was a devastating 10-hour void. 10 empty hours where no alarms were raised. 10 hours where the trail grew agonizingly cold. When law enforcement finally became involved, the investigative logic was swift and unforgiving. Detectives do not deal in assumptions, they deal in behavioral consistencies. Truth is typically a straight line, whereas deception is a shifting labyrinth. Investigators immediately zeroed in on the behavioral anomalies in David's timeline. He initially claimed he had remained at the house after his friends departed. Later, however, his narrative fractured, and he admitted to borrowing a vehicle and leaving the property again in the early morning hours. This erratic behavior and his shifting timeline logically thrust him into the spotlight as the primary suspect. It is a fundamental rule of criminal profiling. The last person to see the victim, especially one whose story repeatedly changes, is scrutinized first. By attempting to deflect blame for his negligence, David's actions fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation.
He didn't report her missing until 8 or 10 hours after she was gone, which we thought was extremely strange. His story changed several times. We caught him in several lies.
Ultimately, David's initial lies, born out of panic and a desperate need to evade responsibility, constructed a heavy shell of suspicion around him. His behavioral inconsistencies logically forced investigators to focus their resources on him, initiating a complex psychological chess match that would obscure the truth for days to come. While the tiny community of Stella was consumed by a frantic, agonizing search for 9-year-old Rowan Ford, one individual's behavior began to deviate sharply from standard criminal expectations. Instead of fleeing the state or hiding from sight, Christopher Collings did the exact opposite. He positioned himself directly at the center of the rescue efforts. He was seen flagging down patrol cars to ask for updates, discussing active investigative theories with anxious neighbors, and even visiting Rowan's mother to offer his personal sympathy. To anyone watching, he looked like a deeply concerned, polite family friend, the familiar figure the victim affectionately called Uncle Chris. But beneath this cooperative exterior, a complex psychological game was playing out, driven by an anomaly known in criminal profiling as investigation stalking. Why does a perpetrator choose to stay close to the authorities rather than running away? In behavioral logic, inserting oneself into an active missing person case serves two distinct psychological purposes. Aggressive surveillance. By remaining near the detectives, the perpetrator can gauge the progress of the case firsthand, monitor what evidence has been uncovered, and attempt to subtly manipulate the narrative. Collings went so far as to point fingers at the stepfather, even offering to wear a wire for the FBI to gather information. He wanted to project the image of the ultimate ally. The crushing weight of guilt. Carrying the absolute truth of a terrible act generates immense cognitive dissonance, an intense internal conflict. Over time, the mind undergoes an agonizing buildup of psychological pressure, creating a subconscious desperation to unburden itself. The perpetrator yearns for relief from the emotional weight, but their self-preservation instinct prevents them from telling just anyone. They require a specific safe vehicle for their admission. For Collings, that emotional anchor was Wheaton Chief of Police Clinton Clark. Chief Clark had known Christopher for 17 years, offering personal guidance and a steady hand when Collings lost his mother during his youth. This deep-seated childhood attachment became the ultimate flaw in Collings' psychological armor. He did not view the chief as an aggressive interrogator, but as a figure of safety. When the news broke on November 9 that Rowan's body had been discovered in a remote sinkhole, the sudden shift in reality completely shattered Collings' composure. Overwhelmed by panic, he didn't seek a lawyer. He sought Chief Clark. Refusing to step foot into a crowded police station, Collings demanded a private space to talk. Chief Clark drove him to the isolated Muncie Bridge just outside of town. As they stepped out of the vehicle, the psychological chess match reached its absolute endgame. The mask of the helpful volunteer dropped entirely. Before the chief could even begin a formal questioning session, Collings held out his hands, voluntarily offering his wrists to be secured. When Chief Clark calmly told him that handcuffs weren't necessary at that moment, Collings looked at the man he had trusted since childhood and delivered a hauntingly logical response. For what I'm about to tell you, you will. Sitting on the quiet slope near the bridge, the facade unraveled completely. Collings broke down and detailed the exact timeline, explaining how he entered the home to take the child while the house was empty. This dramatic shift highlights the profound vulnerability of the criminal mind when the desperate need to relieve psychological weight ultimately overrides the primal instinct for self-preservation. If you want to dive deeper into the dark logic of criminal behavior and explore how behavioral data unravels history's most baffling cases, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Crime Evidence as we break down the hidden mechanics of forensic psychology and justice.
He later threw her body into a sinkhole known as Fox Cave near Powell, Missouri, in McDonald County. Court records show Collings burned the rope he used to strangle Ford, the blood-stained clothing he wore during the attack, and his blood-stained mattress. Collings eventually confessed.
As the investigation into the disappearance of Rowan Ford deepened, law enforcement encountered a baffling psychological maze. While the public focus was split, detectives were forced to look closely at the highly erratic behavior of the stepfather, David Spears. This brings us to the first major hypothesis of the case. David Spears was not merely a negligent bystander, but an active participant who was physically present during the commission of the crime. To evaluate this hypothesis, we must analyze the most compelling piece of objective logic in the entire case file: the discovery of the hidden location. On November 8, a full day before sheriff's deputies officially located Rowan, the Newton County coroner, Mark Bridges, who was a former sheriff and a trusted employer to both men, took David out to search the area. Bridges was working closely with federal investigators and was wearing a hidden recording device. During their drive, Bridges decided to employ a clever psychological technique, asking David to play devil's advocate and put himself in the mind of Christopher Collings. The result was deeply unsettling. Without hesitation, David directed Bridges to a highly obscured, remote sinkhole in McDonald County, known locally as Fox Cave. I said, I would suspect Chris might be involved with this. And if you were Chris, what would you do with Rowan's body? And he thought a minute.
I said, let's go look some places. So we went and looked, and the first place he took me to was the hole in the ground.
From a purely logical standpoint, this action is incredibly difficult to dismiss as a random guess. Fox Cave is not a prominent landmark. It is an obscured opening situated roughly 30 feet off a rural road in a densely wooded area. How could an individual who claimed to be completely asleep at home during the timeline of the disappearance navigate directly to the exact resting place of the victim? Investigative logic strongly suggests that David possessed first-hand intimate knowledge of the crime's aftermath, indicating he was there when the victim was hidden. This logical anchor gained even more weight when David was brought back in for questioning. Confronted with the reality that the body had been found, David delivered a detailed, multi-layered confession. He stated that he had witnessed the initial harms against Rowan at the trailer, actively participated in the tragic outcome, and helped transport and hide the victim using his mother's vehicle. If we accept this hypothesis as true, what psychological mechanisms explain his behavior? First, we must consider the phenomenon of a memory unraveling through the fog of heavy intoxication. David repeatedly stated he had blacked out that night. In behavioral psychology, when an individual experiences a severe alcohol-induced memory gap, their mind becomes highly vulnerable to external suggestions. Under the intense, prolonged pressure of a high-stakes interrogation, a suspect's cognitive defenses can erode. They may begin to piece together fragmented memories with the details provided by investigators, eventually constructing a narrative where they genuinely believe they are guilty. Second, David's confession might represent a psychological mutation of profound guilt. David knew that his choice to leave a 9-year-old child entirely alone in the middle of the night was the direct catalyst for this tragedy. The crushing weight of this responsibility can cause an intense psychological breakdown. To his conscience, his catastrophic failure to protect Rowan felt just as heinous as the physical act of harming her. In a twisted effort to accept punishment and share the immense burden of the outcome with his longtime friend, his mind may have fully embraced a reality where he was a co-conspirator, transforming internal negligence into an explicit admission of guilt.
The two appeared in court in Cassville in Berry County, Missouri. The two were arrested on Monday, 3 days after Rowan Ford's body was found about 10 miles from her home. According to investigators, both men have admitted taking part in the crime, but today in court entered pleas of not guilty. Today, Spears and Collins were heavily guarded, wearing both wrist and leg shackles. Ford's mother, Colleen Spears, was also in court today, joined by several family members. While many in the community of Stella continue to grieve and hope for justice, they did not attend court proceedings this morning.
After a week of frantically searching, authorities found the child in a sinkhole in McDonald County, about 10 miles from her home. Investigators say Collings eventually confessed.
A lot of people have questioned.
While the hypothesis of a shared conspiracy presents a highly dramatic twist for any investigator, a second, far more scientifically grounded hypothesis exists. Christopher Collings acted entirely alone. Under this analytical lens, David Spears' shocking self-incrimination is reclassified as a classic textbook phenomenon, a false confession born out of psychological collapse, intense interrogation fatigue, and a broken mind. To understand how a lone actor executed this crime, we must look away from the emotionally charged interrogation tapes and focus strictly on the immutable logic of time, space, and physical data. The foundational pillar of this lone actor hypothesis rests on a highly precise timeline gap created by geography and intoxication. On the night of November 2, when the three men wrapped up their gathering at the trailer, Nathan Mahurin made a very specific logistical decision. Heavily intoxicated and highly anxious about encountering law enforcement patrols on the primary routes, Mahurin chose to navigate slow, winding back roads to drop David off at his residence. This deliberate detour created a significant mathematically predictable delay. Christopher, operating with swift intent, immediately boarded his pickup truck and took the high-speed main highway, the fastest possible route back to Stella. Because the highway cut travel time in half, Christopher managed to arrive at the residence, enter the structure, and depart with the victim before Mahurin's vehicle had even turned onto David Street. The mechanics of the evening did not require an accomplice. The roads themselves provided a flawless window for an isolated intruder to act entirely undetected. This timeline logic is heavily reinforced by a complete lack of physical data, a literal forensic void surrounding the stepfather. When state, federal, and independent crime laboratories processed the evidence, the scientific results were starkly one-sided. Analysts meticulously swept Christopher's pickup truck and recovered the victim's hair fibers, confirming transport. They excavated Christopher's property and found clear ash remnants in an outdoor burn pit, proving the destruction of evidence. However, when it came to David, the data completely vanished. Investigators found absolutely zero biological material on his clothing or person, indicating no physical contact whatsoever. Furthermore, a thorough forensic sweep of the mother's SUV, which David had borrowed that night, yielded no DNA, no fibers, and no trace data. In the world of forensic science, a confession can be manufactured by a panicked mind, but physical data cannot be willed into existence. The total absence of David's physical signature strongly proves that his subsequent confession was a psychological fiction. If the physical data points exclusively to a single perpetrator, how do we explain the escalation from an initial intrusion to a tragic outcome? The answer lies in the volatile psychology of spontaneous panic. When Christopher entered the dark bedroom, his entire plan relied on the cover of night and the victim's deep sleep to maintain total anonymity. But a catastrophic shift occurred. The victim woke up, looked over her shoulder, and recognized the face of the man who had lived in her home. She recognized Uncle Chris. In criminal profiling, unexpected recognition by a victim completely dismantles an offender's cognitive control. A sharp, blinding panic immediately overwrites any original intent. Christopher instantly realized that the moment she spoke his name, his life as he knew it was effectively over. To protect his own identity, he made a sudden, morbidly defensive choice to eliminate the only witness who could expose him. This was not a calculated, premeditated plot hatched by two men. It was an isolated, frantic act of self-preservation executed entirely by a lone actor trapped by his own fatal mistake. If you want to stay updated as we untangle the deep psychological mechanics of history's most complex trials, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join our community at Crime Evidence. The most terrifying aspect of criminal psychology is not the threat of a nameless stranger lurking in the shadows, but the proximity of the familiar. When the mask finally slipped from Christopher Collings, the community was forced to confront a deeply unsettling concept known in behavioral science as betrayal trauma. This psychological framework describes the severe emotional and cognitive disruption that occurs when a person's trust is violated by an individual upon whom they depend for safety, connection, or survival. For a 9-year-old child, adults within her immediate domestic circle are instinctively categorized as protectors. Christopher had spent months living in the family's basement, stepping into the role of a trusted figure who regularly helped Rowan with her schoolwork. To her, he wasn't a threat. He was simply Uncle Chris. This established bond of familiarity acts as a psychological cloaking device. In normal human development, children utilize environmental cues to sense danger, a strange voice, an unfamiliar face, or an unexpected intrusion. However, when the predator is an embedded acquaintance, the victim's natural survival instincts are effectively neutralized. The brain fails to activate its defensive alarm systems because the visual and cognitive data match an established profile of safety. Rowan did not fear Christopher because her memory associated him with quiet evenings, homework support, and routine family dynamics. This psychological vulnerability is what makes betrayal trauma so devastating. It strips the victim of their primary defense mechanism, suspicion, long before any physical confrontation even begins. From the perspective of criminal logic, Christopher's choice of target reveals a cold, opportunistic exploitation of this trust. Perpetrators who target individuals within their own social network rarely act at random. They consciously weaponize their familiar status to minimize logistical hurdles. Christopher thoroughly understood the internal rhythm of the household. He knew the layout of the building. He knew the mother worked regular overnight shifts, and he knew precisely when the residents would be left exposed. More importantly, Christopher relied on his familiar facade as an invisible key to gain entry without causing an immediate disturbance. In a small town where any strange noise or sudden outcry would draw instant attention from nearby neighbors, executing an intrusion requires absolute silence. By utilizing his status as a trusted family friend, Christopher ensured that even if the victim woke up, his presence would not immediately trigger panic. Familiarity eliminates the friction of resistance. If a child opens her eyes in the dark and sees a stranger, the immediate physiological response is to scream. But if she sees a familiar face, the brain hesitates, processing the event as a confusing but non-threatening anomaly. Christopher used this brief critical window of hesitation to carry out his actions smoothly, preventing any outcry or struggle that could have alerted the outside world. Ultimately, the behavioral analysis of this phase reveals that the tragic efficiency of the crime was not the result of a sophisticated tactical breach, but rather the calculated manipulation of an innocent child's trust. The familiar mask allowed the threat to walk straight through the defenses of the home, proving that the ultimate vulnerability is often found not in a lack of physical security, but in the presence of unearned trust. In the theater of criminal justice, a profound tension often exists between human testimony and hard scientific data. When a non-complex investigation begins, detectives naturally rely on behavioral cues, shifting timelines, and intensive interrogations to build a coherent narrative. However, this reliance introduces a significant cognitive vulnerability known as confirmation bias. This psychological phenomenon occurs when investigators form a strong initial hypothesis and then subconsciously filter all subsequent information to validate that belief, while completely ignoring or dismissing contradictory data. In the tracking of Rowan Ford's case, confirmation bias locked its sights directly onto the stepfather, David Spears. David's initial actions practically invited this investigative bias. His erratic timelines, his catastrophic failure to report the missing child for nearly 10 hours, and his active discouragement of his wife calling emergency services painted a psychological portrait of absolute guilt. When he was eventually brought back into the interrogation room and delivered a highly detailed confession, explicitly claiming he actively participated in the harmful acts and personally helped transport the victim, investigators believed the case was definitively solved. Human instinct and intense emotional outrage demanded that David be held accountable. Once a suspect confesses to a terrible crime, it is incredibly difficult for the human mind to reset its focus. Every nervous gesture, defensive statement, or memory gap from David was viewed exclusively through the lens of his guaranteed complicity. The subjective power of a spoken confession threatened to completely dictate the outcome of the legal process. But a modern justice system cannot survive on intuition or emotion alone. It demands empirical, verifiable validation. This is where the battle between subjective testimony and objective data reached its critical turning point. While investigators held a written, signed confession from David, forensic teams were quietly processing the physical reality of the crime scene. Biological samples, fiber evidence, and trace data were meticulously analyzed across 3 separate entities: the State Police Laboratory, the FBI Lab, and a highly specialized independent testing facility. The scientific data returned a stunningly definitive verdict. There was a complete forensic void surrounding David Spears. No biological markers, no clothing fibers, and no trace elements linked David to the victim, the primary scene, or the transportation vehicle. Conversely, the physical data perfectly and exclusively aligned with the independent, isolated movements of Christopher Collings. Furthermore, forensic analysis exposed deep logical inconsistencies within David's spoken confession. The physical dynamics of the scene and the forensic timeline simply did not match his description of how the tragic events unfolded. Faced with this stark contradiction, the prosecution made a difficult but vital systemic decision to drop the primary charges against the stepfather. To pursue a major conviction based solely on a flawed confession that contradicted physical reality would be a severe violation of legal ethics. Objective science had effectively demolished the confirmation bias that gripped the investigation. This critical pivot demonstrates why justice must always elevate cold, impartial data above human intuition. Even when public anger and initial suspicion point entirely toward a specific individual, the rigorous application of forensic science ensures that the law penalizes actual proven actions, rather than the psychological anomalies of a panicked mind.
In 2012, a jury from Platte County in a courtroom in Phelps County. Ford's stepfather, David Spears, was also charged with murder and rape, but pleaded guilty to reduced charges of child endangerment and hindering prosecution.
Barry County prosecuting attorney Johnny Cox faced an unprecedented crisis that completely paralyzed the conventional momentum of the legal process. He held two separate, signed confessions for the exact same tragic event, yet they presented completely incompatible realities. Christopher Collings insisted he operated entirely as a lone actor. David Spears claimed he was an active co-conspirator who participated in the final acts. For a minister of justice, this was not a double victory. It was a devastating legal paradox that threatened to collapse the integrity of the entire prosecution. To understand the logic behind Cox's ultimate decision to drop the primary charges against David, one must analyze the complex mechanics of trial strategy. A prosecutor cannot simply throw contradictory narratives at a jury and hope for a conviction. The state is legally and ethically required to present a single, cohesive, and logically sound theory of the crime. If Cox attempted to take both men to trial for first-degree murder, he would find himself in an impossible position. He would be forced to stand before a jury and argue that Christopher's account was completely accurate, while simultaneously presenting David's contradictory account as absolute truth. The state's own evidence would effectively be at war with itself inside the courtroom. This structural flaw would provide a massive vulnerability for defense attorneys to exploit. The cornerstone of the criminal justice system is the strict standard of proof known as reasonable doubt. The defense does not need to prove a client's innocence. They merely need to demonstrate that the state's narrative is uncertain. If the prosecution presents two distinct stories that cannot logically coexist, they inadvertently hand the defense its most powerful weapon. Collings' defense team would point to David's confession to argue that the state lacked clarity on the identity of the true physical perpetrator. Meanwhile, David's defense would highlight the total lack of forensic data, and Christopher's consistent insistence on acting alone. By trying to punish both men based on conflicting statements, the prosecution risked creating a massive cloud of systemic confusion, potentially leading to a catastrophic scenario where a jury acquits both individuals due to a lack of a definitive narrative. Cox recognized that a double acquittal was a risk that public safety and the memory of the victim could not afford. The independent forensic data was clear and uncompromising. It points exclusively to Collings. Pursuing David for an offense that the physical evidence proved he did not physically commit would be a severe violation of legal ethics. Furthermore, if David were convicted on a flawed confession, a higher court could easily overturn the verdict on appeal due to the complete lack of corroborating trace data. This potential legal fallout could then ripple into Christopher's case, creating procedural errors that might jeopardize the entire judicial outcome. Faced with this high-stakes dilemma, Cox made a calculated, tactical pivot. He withdrew the charges of first-degree murder and assault against David Spears. Instead, he pursued a strategic resolution focusing strictly on what could be definitively proven through behavioral logic and timeline data, hindering prosecution and endangering the welfare of a child. By securing the maximum allowable sentences for these offenses, Cox successfully held the stepfather accountable for his catastrophic negligence and subsequent deception. More importantly, this strategic withdrawal cleared the legal landscape, allowing the state to present a clean, unburdened, forensic-driven case against Christopher Collings, ensuring that the true perpetrator faced the ultimate penalty. When the state of Missouri brought Christopher Collings to trial, the courtroom transformed into a high-stakes arena where forensic facts clashed directly with psychological mitigation. Facing the ultimate legal penalty, the defense team recognized that they could not dispute the overwhelming physical data linking their client to the crime scene. Instead, they focused their strategy entirely on the offender's personal history, attempting to construct a robust psychological shield around his actions to reduce his legal culpability in the eyes of the jury. The defense introduced detailed testimony from developmental experts who mapped out a bleak, highly unstable childhood characterized by profound emotional deprivation. As the youngest of 6 children who were all eventually removed from their biological parents and placed into the foster care system due to chronic family instability, Christopher experienced a total lack of consistent love and emotional support during his most critical developmental years. Experts diagnosed him with severe disorganized dissociative attachment disorder and intermittent explosive personality disorder. They argued that this early neglect left him fundamentally damaged, stunting his emotional growth and rendering him incapable of forming healthy human connections or processing intense panic with rational deliberation. The defense urged the jury to view the event not as a calculated plot, but as a chaotic, unguided reaction from a broken individual who lacked the mental tools to navigate a sudden crisis. However, this psychological mitigation strategy encountered an unyielding wall of logical refutation from the jury. While the jurors acknowledged the tragedy of Christopher's early life, their primary legal responsibility was to evaluate his cognitive control and intent during the specific timeline of the offense. In criminal law, a troubled past can provide context for an offender's emotional deficits, but it cannot erase legal accountability for deliberate actions. The jury's counterargument relied on a strict, objective analysis of Christopher's behavior before, during, and after the confrontation. They noted that to accept the defense's theory of a purely impulsive, uncontrollable surge of panic, the offender's subsequent actions would have to reflect that same chaotic confusion. The empirical data, however, demonstrated a high level of systematic calculation. The prosecution systematically proved that an individual completely incapacitated by a psychological disorder does not execute a highly structured professional cover-up. Christopher's choices following the incident revealed a sharp, intact cognitive focus. He meticulously selected a highly obscured remote sinkhole miles away to hide the victim, demonstrating clear spatial awareness and a conscious intent to prevent detection. He then returned to his property to engage in an organized destruction of evidence, burning items inside a wood stove to erase trace data. Most tellingly, he evaluated the risks of his cleanup process, realizing that burning a bulky mattress out in the open would create an unusually large fire and draw immediate public suspicion from neighbors. He rationally rolled it up, contained it within a metal drum, and moved it inside a barn to hide the flames. Furthermore, his interactions with law enforcement in the days that followed fabricating a timeline to match his friend's account, deliberately omitting incriminating details, and proactively monitoring the local police chief reflected a controlled, deliberate effort to evade justice. These were the sequential logical choices of a person who fully understood the wrongfulness of his actions and possessed the cognitive clarity necessary to manipulate reality. By prioritizing the cold logic of his post-offense behavior over his developmental trauma, the jury concluded that past suffering cannot excuse conscious choices, ultimately delivering a verdict of first-degree murder.
An execution date has been requested for Christopher Collings. He was convicted for the abduction, rape, and murder of a 9-year-old from Stella, Missouri. Investigators say he threw Rowan Ford's body into a sinkhole in McDonald County. Investigators say he eventually confessed. If the Missouri Supreme Court chooses to issue an execution warrant, the date will be set between 90 and 120 days after.
On December 3, 2024, the long and agonizing legal journey of the Rowan Ford case finally reached its absolute conclusion at the State Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Christopher Collings, 49 years old, faced the ultimate penalty via a lethal injection of pentobarbital, with his death officially pronounced just 9 minutes later. Yet the final chapter of this tragedy was defined not by quiet accountability, but by a striking display of cognitive dissonance from the perpetrator. In his final written statement, Collings penned a message that deeply unsettled observers, offering a casual apology to anyone he had hurt and stating that he hoped to see them in heaven one day. In behavioral profiling, this rhetoric reflects a profound psychological defense mechanism. It allows a detached individual to completely separate their horrific historical choices from their self-perceived spiritual standing, attempting to claim moral absolution while entirely failing to comprehend the permanent reality of the innocent life they extinguished. For the professionals who lived in the shadow of this investigation for 17 years, the execution offered a somber conclusion, but it could never fully heal the collective wound inflicted on the region. Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings, who carried Rowan's school identification card in his uniform pocket every single day for nearly 2 decades, reflected that true justice could only ever be partial. The permanent scar left on the community was a painful reminder of a systemic breakdown. Jennings noted with profound regret that while various local hotlines had received concerning reports regarding the vulnerabilities in Rowan's domestic life long before the tragedy, that vital data was never properly funneled to law enforcement. This massive communication failure effectively left a child isolated, highlighting a devastating reality. The institutional safety nets designed to safeguard the vulnerable are only as effective as the active, coordinated vigilance of the community supporting them. This narrative delivers a vital societal and operational lesson that remains highly relevant today. The tragedy fundamentally revolutionized how law enforcement agencies in the region conduct protective investigations involving children. The operational philosophy shifted permanently from a reactive stance to an uncompromisingly proactive one. Investigators learned the hard way that when a child's safety is compromised, waiting for absolute undeniable proof before taking action is a luxury that costs lives. Today, the agency operating under this legacy prioritizes immediate intervention over domestic preservation, actively choosing to remove vulnerable individuals from high-risk environments at the very first sign of instability. On a broader scale, the core lesson of this case is a stark warning against the dangers of social complacency. It proves that inside small, tightly knit towns, the comforting belief that everything is fine because we are neighbors can create a fatal blind spot, reminding us that protecting the innocent requires constant awareness rather than passive trust. Thank you for following this comprehensive, multi-part analytical series into one of the most structurally and psychologically complex cases in modern forensic history. If you value highly detailed, data-driven deep dives into criminal logic, behavioral analysis, and the cold mechanics of systemic justice, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. By joining our community at Crime Evidence, you help us continue to unmask the hidden truths and preserve the critical lessons hidden within historical case files. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upcoming Kishban dossier breakdown, and share your analytical thoughts on this conclusion in the comments below.